The cold woke her before the bell ever could, the particular cold of an attic room under the slates in the last week of October, and Nora lay still for a moment beneath the thin counterpane and let her eyes find the gray seam of light at the edge of the curtain. No fire up here, of course, only her own breath, a small pale cloud that rose and vanished in the dark. Somewhere below, 2 floors down and half a house away, the stable clock struck the half-hour, and she counted it without needing to. 5:30. Ivy stirred in the other bed, the ropes beneath the mattress giving a low complaint, and murmured something that was not quite words, and Nora swung her legs out onto the bare boards and felt the cold come up through her feet like water rising. She dressed in the dark from long habit, fingers finding buttons without needing eyes, her print dress cool and slightly damp with the night's air, for nothing dried properly this time of year, not up under the roof where the chimney breasts ran through, but gave off no warmth to speak of. She tied her apron by feel, the strings crossing at her back and knotting at the front, the way Mrs. Pargeter had shown her 4 years ago when she'd first come to the house at 15 with her box and her reference and her hands still soft as a child's. They were not soft now. She flexed them once, feeling the small tightness of a chapped knuckle, and reached for the ewer. The water in the basin had a skin of cold on it, not ice, not yet, but close, and it woke her fully in a way the dark and the hour had not, a bright shock across her face and throat that made her gasp once, quietly, so as not to wake Ivy further, though Ivy was already up now too, a shape moving against the paler dark of the window, pulling her own dress over her head with the practiced speed of a woman who had done this 6 mornings a week for 11 years and no longer thought about it at all. The water smelled of nothing, or of the tin jug it had stood in overnight, faintly metallic, and the cloth Nora wrung out and pressed to her face smelled of yesterday's sun, having dried on the line strung across the box room before the weather turned. She found her cap by touch on the nail beside the door and pinned it without a glass, for there was no glass up here worth the name, only a sliver of mirror Ivy had propped on the washstand, spotted brown at the corners, and in it Nora's face came back to her, only in pieces. An eye, the line of her jaw, enough to know the cap sat straight, and no more. Below the window the yard was still full dark, but a single light burned in the stable block, low and steady, which meant Tom the under-coachman was already about his own morning, and somewhere further off a dog gave one bark and then thought better of it. They went down together, she and Ivy, along the narrow attic passage with its low ceiling that Nora still ducked from habit, though she had long since learned exactly where the beam hung, past the other doors, the kitchen maids, the 2 housemaids who shared beyond that, the box room smelling of camphor and old wool, and down the back stairs, uncarpeted, cold underfoot even through her boots, the wood worn pale and slightly hollowed in the center of each tread by feet going up and down them for 100 years before her own. A candle burned at the turn of the stairs, left by whoever had come down first, and its small flame bent and steadied as they passed. The house at this hour had a smell all its own that Nora had come to love without ever quite deciding to. Cold stone, beeswax, the ash of last night's fires not yet swept, and under it all, very faint, the green smell of the garden coming in through some crack or other, for the house was never quite sealed against the outdoors. Not really, not in a place this old. In the housemaid's pantry off the back passage, she took up her housemaid's box. The wooden carrier, with its brushes and blacklead and leathers and dusters, all fitted into their places the way Mrs. Pargeter required, each thing where it belonged and nowhere else, and slung her Hessian apron over the print one for the rough work of the grates. Ivy had already gone ahead toward the dining room with her own box, moving in that unhurried, economical way she had, no wasted step in it, and Nora followed a moment behind, the passage lit only by the candle she carried, its flame throwing her shadow long and then short again against the paneling as she went. The green baize door stood open on its spring, propped so, and she went through into the family's part of the house, where the carpet began, and her footsteps went from a clatter to a hush. This was the hour she liked best, though she would not have called it liking exactly, only a kind of ease, for the rooms belonged to her at 5:30 in a way they never did once the family were about. No one to step around, no one to fall silent for, just herself and the cold hearths and the long curtains still drawn against a sky that had not yet decided whether it meant to be light. She knelt at the dining-room grate first, as she did every morning, and set down her box, and by the light of the one candle began the work her hands knew better than her mind did. Out came yesterday's ash, soft and pale gray, into the ash pan, a fine dust of it rising and catching at the back of her throat, familiar as breathing. She swept the hearthstone clean with the small brush, then the fire iron set aside on a cloth so as not to mark the fender, and then came the black lead, worked into the cold iron with a brush in slow, firm strokes, back and forth, until her arm found its rhythm and her mind could wander a little, the way it always did on the grates, off toward nothing in particular, the shape of the day ahead, whether it might rain before the wash was in, whether cook had said there'd be a rabbit pie today. The black lead had its own smell, sharp and mineral, not unpleasant, and it left her fingertips gray no matter how careful she was, a gray that would not fully wash out until Sunday. When the iron had taken its polish and gave back a dull gleam even in the candlelight, she buffed it with the leather until the gleam sharpened, and only then laid the new fire, kneeling close to the hearth, the cold of the stone coming up through her apron and stockings into her knees. Paper twisted first, then the kindling laid across it in the crossed pattern she had been taught and had taught in her turn to the girl before this one left, and small coal over that, not too much, for a fire wanted air to catch, and she struck the match and held it to the paper's edge and watched the small flame run along the twist and catch, and steady into something that would hold until it was wanted, unlit as yet, only laid and ready, for the family would not be down for hours, and it was not her place to light it before its time unless the room were wanted early. She was on her feet again and moving to the next hearth almost before she had finished the thought, for the morning room wanted doing too, and after that the library and the work did not wait on her noticing it. It simply carried her forward one grate to the next, the way the current of a stream carries a leaf, without any great decision on her part, only the next task and the next. Down the passage she went again for more coal from the scuttle, kept filled by the hall boy, the weight of it dragging pleasantly at her arm, a good ordinary weight, the kind that told a body it was doing something real. Behind her, faintly, she heard Ivy's brush going in the drawing-room, the same steady scrape and pause, and further off still, the first clatter of the kitchen coming to life, a door, a pan set down, Cook's voice pitched low but carrying, and Nora felt the house waking around her the way she felt it every morning, floor by floor, room by room, herself among the very first threads of it. By the time the grates were done in the three main rooms, the sky had lightened enough that she could work by it instead of the candle, a gray, reluctant light that came in flat and colorless through the tall windows and made the dust motes visible where she stirred them. She set down her black lead box and took up the dustpan and the tin of tea leaves kept damp in a covered jar for exactly this purpose. The leaves from yesterday's servants' hall pot, saved rather than thrown out, for a dry broom on a dry carpet only sent the dust up into the air to settle again an hour later, whereas a handful of damp leaves scattered thin across the pile caught the dust and held it and swept up dark with it, leaving the carpet's colors clean and the air behind her clear. She liked the smell of it, worked so often into the pattern of her mornings that it had become one of the smells of the house itself, faintly bitter, faintly like the last inch of a cup gone cold. She scattered a handful across the drawing-room carpet, working from the far corner toward the door so as never to sweep herself into a room she'd already done, and drew the broom in long, even strokes with the grain of the pile, the leaves darkening as they gathered the gray dust of a day and a night and swept the whole of it into the pan at last, a soft heap that smelled of tea and coal smoke and the house entire. The furniture wanted attention after, for a carpet swept in a great black meant nothing if the mantel stood dull, and so she went along the room with her dusters. First the dry one for the surface dust, then the beeswax worked in with a soft cloth into the mahogany of the sideboard, into the curls and hollows of the picture frames, into the legs of the little tables that always seemed to collect more dust than anything twice their size, rubbed until her arm ached pleasantly, and the wood gave back a low, soft shine rather than a hard shop window gloss. For Mrs. Pargeter held that a house furnished 100 years should not look as if it had been bought yesterday. The beeswax smelled of honey and turpentine both, warm even in the cold room, and it stayed on her hands the rest of the morning, no matter how she scrubbed, a faint sweetness under the black leads gray. She was dusting the picture rail in the morning room, up on her toes with the long-handled brush, when the clock in the hall struck 7, and somewhere below the green baize door a bell rang, a single, sharp double note that carried through the whole back of the house, and without needing to think about it, Nora knew from the sound alone which bell it was. The numbers ran along the board in the housemaid's passage, each with its little swinging indicator, and long practice had taught her the particular pitch of the library's bell from the morning rooms, though at this hour, before the family were even stirring, it would only be Mr. Sowerby testing the wires, as he did most mornings, walking the pull cords room by room to be sure each rang true. For a silent bell was a small catastrophe waiting to happen, and Mr. Sowerby did not care for catastrophes, small or large. By 7:30, the fires downstairs were laid, and the grates in the family's rooms finished, and Nora came back through the baize door into the world that was properly hers, the flagged passage cool underfoot, the smell changing at once from beeswax and cold ash to something warmer, bacon and bread, and the particular smell of a big kitchen range that had been alight since before 5, iron and heat, and a faint sweetness of scorched flour, where Sarah the kitchen maid had already been at the ovens. The servants' hall table was laid when she came in, the long scrubbed deal table with its places set in the order they had always been set, and she took her own place well down the table, below Ivy, and below the two housemaids senior to her, and well below the upper servants, who breakfasted a little later, and separately more often than not, though this morning Mr. Sowerby was already at the table's head, reading a letter with his spectacles pushed low on his nose, and beside him the empty chair that would be Mrs. Pargeter's when she came down from her own small breakfast in the housekeeper's room. The bacon was good, and the bread was yesterday's but toasted at the range till it lost the staleness, and there was a pot of strong tea going round that had been steeping since the first of them sat down, and Nora ate quickly but without hurry, the way one learns to eat when a meal is a known fixed length of time and not a moment more, exchanging a few words with the footman William across from her about whether the frost would hold, and half listening to the hall boy being teased by Sarah about a girl in the village, and under it all the comfortable clatter of cutlery and crockery, and the range ticking as it heated, and the low, continuous murmur of a household that knew itself and its own rhythm so well that very little needed saying at all. Someone passed the marmalade before she asked for it. Someone else remarked that the coal was burning poorly this week, too much slate in the last delivery, and cook, coming through from the kitchen with a tray, agreed without looking up, and it was the kind of talk that filled a room without weighing on it, ordinary as the tea itself. Mrs. Pargeter arrived midway through, small and upright in her black dress, with the chatelaine of keys at her waist that never seemed to make a sound however fast she moved, and took her place, and the talk did not stop for her, but shifted a little, quieter, more mindful, the way water finds a new course around a stone without ceasing to run. She asked Nora in passing whether the library grate had drawn well that morning, for it had smoked a little the week before, and Nora told her it had drawn clean, and Mrs. Pargeter nodded once and moved on to asking William about the silver, and that was the whole of it, a question and an answer, and the day going on. There was a rhythm to the servants' hall that Nora had come to know as well as she knew the grates, who sat where and who spoke first, and who might make the housekeeper smile without ever quite risking a joke that missed its mark, and she found she liked her place in it, well enough down the table to be easy, near enough the middle to hear everything worth hearing. Breakfast did not linger. By 10 to 8 the plates were cleared, and the tea leaves from the pot went into the covered jar for tomorrow's sweeping, nothing wasted that could still be put to use, and Mrs. Pargeter rose, and the hall rose with her in its own unhurried way, chairs scraping back on the flagstones, and the day's proper work began. Upstairs the family would be waking soon, or had woken already. A lady's maid's bell had gone not 10 minutes before, and Nora had heard the quick tread of Miss Ellen, the lady's maid, going up the front stairs with the morning tray of tea and biscuits that went to her ladyship's room before anything else in the house stirred for her. That was not Nora's work, and she gave it no more thought than she gave the weather in the next county, only noted it the way she noted everything, a small mark on the long map of the day. Her own next task waited in the housemaid's pantry, the brass to be done before the hall clock struck 9, the stair rods that ran the length of the great staircase, and after that the bedrooms, once the family had properly risen and gone down to their own breakfast and left the rooms clear for her hands. The brass took her the better part of half an hour. The long row of stair rods that held the carpet fast to each tread of the great staircase, each one lifted from its brackets, polished on a folded cloth spread over her knee, and set back exactly as it had come, for a stair rod set crooked caught the eye of anyone coming down before they'd even reached the hall, or so Mrs. Pargeter always said, and Nora had never once seen her wrong about such things. The Polish had its own sharp smell, close to vinegar, that caught at the back of the nose and left her fingers stained faintly yellow beneath the gray the blacklead had already given them. 2 colors now instead of 1, the record of a morning's work written plain on her own hands. She worked her way down from the top, rod by rod, kneeling on each stair in turn, the carpets piled rough through her stocking, and by the 9th or 10th rod her knees had found their old ache, familiar as an old shoe, not pain exactly, only the body's honest account of what it had been asked to do. The doorknobs and finger plates along the landing wanted the same brisk polish, and the letter box in the front hall, and the fender in the morning room. She had already blacked, but whose brass rail always dulled again by mid-morning, no matter what she did to it, house dust being what it was. She worked steadily, without hurrying, and without pausing longer than a task required, for the water would want carrying soon, and there was a particular order to the morning that could not be got out of joint without the whole of the rest of the day feeling it. That order took her next to the back stairs, with 2 cans of hot water fresh from the kitchen boiler, 1 in each hand, the weight of them dragging at her shoulders and swinging a little with each step, so that she had long since learned to walk in a certain steady rhythm to keep them from slopping over her skirt, up the narrow stairs 2 floors to the bedroom passage, where the air was cooler and smelled of nothing so much as clean linen, and very faintly of the lavender water Miss Ellen kept in the linen press. She set the cans down outside the first door, knocked once, low, and hearing nothing. For the room's occupant, one of the younger sons down from Oxford for the shooting, had already gone down, let herself in and crossed to the washstand, where she poured the hot water into the ewer, emptied yesterday's slop pail into the covered pail she carried for that purpose down to the sluice room later, and set fresh towels folded over the rail. The room, once the water was seen to, wanted its own attention. The bed stripped back to air, the window opened a hand's width to let the night's staleness out, whatever the weather, for Mrs. Pargeter believed firmly in fresh air over a made bed hurried, and Nora had come round entirely to her way of thinking on the matter, having seen for herself how a room aired properly in the morning smelled sweeter by evening than one shut close. She smoothed the sheets, turned the blankets back in the neat fold, plumped the pillows with 2 quick blows of her fist against each side, and drew the counterpane up and over with a motion so practised she could have done it with her eyes shut, and very nearly did, for her mind had already gone ahead to the next room, and the one after that, the whole passage of them laid out in her head like a row of grates, waiting their turn. Room by room she went in this way, water and slops and linen, and the bed set to rights, the washstand wiped, the grate seen to if it wanted a fire lit for later, the hearth swept whether it did or not, and in each room some small variation to keep her attention from going entirely to habit. A book left open on a table that she squared but did not close, not knowing which page was wanted. A window that stuck and needed a firm push with the heel of her hand before it would give. A dressing table crowded with silver-backed brushes and little glass bottles that she dusted around with especial care, for breakage came out of wages, and no one wanted that, least of all herself, who had seen it happen to a girl before her and did not care to see it again. The smell changed room to room, too, faint as it was. One held a trace of pipe smoke from the night before, another the sweetish memory of scent, another nothing at all but cold, clean air and beeswax. And she moved through all of it, the way a bee moves through a garden, taking what each room offered and leaving it neater than she'd found it. By 10:30, the bedrooms were done, and the linen from the beds carried down in a great soft armful to the housemaid's cupboard to be sorted. Some of it fit to go straight back, some set aside for the wash on Monday, and Nora's arms ached in the particular way they ached most mornings by this hour, not sharply, only a low, steady tiredness in the muscle that she had long since stopped noticing as anything but the ordinary feel of being alive and at work. She took a moment, no more than that, leaning at the passage window with the linen basket balanced on the sill, to look down into the kitchen garden below, where the gardener's boy was barrowing something along the path, his breath showing white in the cold, and beyond the wall the park ran away pale gold and brown toward a line of beech trees. She had watched turn color these 4 years running, each autumn a little different from the last, though she could not have said exactly how. There was rug beating to be got through before dinner, 3 of the smaller carpets from the morning room and the little sitting room off the hall, carried out over her shoulder to the yard where a stout frame stood for the purpose, and she hung each one and took the cane beater to it with a good will, the dust flying out in soft gray clouds that caught the low sun and hung a moment before drifting off across the yard, the sound of the beating, a dull, satisfying thud that carried across to where William was polishing boots at the scullery door and called out that she'd wake the dead with that racket, to which she called back that the dead could do with waking on a morning like this, and they both laughed, and she went on beating, arm rising and falling in its own steady rhythm, until the carpets gave up no more dust and hung clean and pale in the cold air, ready to be carried in and laid flat again before the family thought to notice they had ever been gone. Her hands by now were red with the cold and the work both, and there was a graze along one knuckle from a picture frame's corner she had misjudged an hour before, small and already forgotten, the kind of mark that came and went across a week without ever amounting to anything worth mentioning. She flexed her fingers as she gathered the last carpet up onto her shoulder, felt the ache settle into something almost pleasant, the honest tiredness of a morning's real work behind her, and went in through the yard door and along the passage toward the servants' hall, where the smell of the midday dinner was already beginning to gather, and where, in not much more than an hour, she would sit down again at the long table and eat with an appetite the morning had thoroughly earned her. Dinner in the servants' hall at 12:30 was the best attended meal of the day. Everyone gathered at once in a way that did not always happen at breakfast or supper, and the table filled with the low, comfortable noise of a household sitting down together after a morning's scattered work. There was a good mutton pie and boiled potatoes and a dish of cabbage from the kitchen garden, still faintly earthy for all Sarah's washing of it, and the smell of it all rose warm off the table the moment the dishes were set down, gravy and pastry and the particular sweetness of the onion cook favored in her pies. Mr. Sowerby carved, as he always did, standing at the head of the table with the quiet ceremony he brought to everything, and the plates went round in their proper order, upper servants first, though it was no more than a moment's difference in practice, everyone served and eating within a few minutes of the first plate going out. Nora ate with the same steady appetite she always brought to this meal, the morning's work sitting behind her like a debt now paid, and found herself in conversation with Ivy about the linen. 3 pillowcases wanting mending, one with a seam gone at the corner that Ivy thought might be beyond saving, and Nora thought could still be turned. And about the half-day that was coming to Ivy at the week's end, a whole afternoon and evening free to walk into the village and see her mother, a fortnight's rest earned and looked forward to, with the particular quiet pleasure of someone who did not get such days often and knew exactly how she meant to spend the one she had. Nora's own half-day was a week off yet, and she found she did not mind the waiting, for a thing looked forward to at a week's distance had its own pleasant weight to carry through the days between. The talk round the table ran on in its usual unhurried way. The frost that had silvered the lawn that morning, and what it might mean for the last of the dahlias. A letter William had from his brother in the army, stationed somewhere with an unfamiliar name that no one at the table could quite place on a map, though several tried, and Cook's opinion, delivered with the flat authority of 20 years in the kitchen, that the pheasants sent up from the chute that morning would want hanging a good week yet before they were fit to touch. Mrs. Pargeter and Mr. Sowerby withdrew before the pudding came round, as they sometimes did, taking their coffee in the housekeeper's room, the small parlor the servants called, half in fondness and half in the old joke, none of them could trace the origin of any longer, the pug's parlor, though there was no pug in it, nor ever had been in Nora's time, only a good fire and 2 comfortable chairs and a shelf of account books Mrs. Pargeter kept in a hand so neat it might have been engraved. Dinner cleared, Nora went up to the housemaid's room to change, out of the print dress that had done the morning's rough work, and into the black afternoon dress with its white cap and apron, the uniform that meant a different half of the day had begun. Quieter work, work that might be seen by the family rather than done entirely around their absence. She washed her hands and face again at the basin, working the last of the black lead gray from under her nails with the small brush kept for the purpose, and pinned a fresh cap in place of the plainer one worn for the grates, and looked, when she caught her reflection in Ivy's spotted mirror, entirely different from the girl who had knelt at the dining-room hearth 6 hours before, though she felt, under the clean apron, exactly the same, only a little more tired and a great deal more awake. The afternoon's work had its own character, lighter in the body, though it asked something else of her, a steadier attention, a readiness to be called. She sat for the better part of an hour in the housemaid's sewing room with the basket of mending, the pillowcase Ivy had marked as doubtful, turned inside out under her needle, the seam picked out and reset with small even stitches, the thread waxed first so it would not knot, the work quiet and close and lit by the gray afternoon light through a small window that looked out over the stable yard. There was a comfort in it. After the morning's larger labors, the whole world narrowed down to a few inches of linen and the careful passage of a needle, and she found her mind wandering pleasantly as she sewed, toward nothing in particular, the way it always did over needlework, half attentive to the stitch and half adrift. A bell went twice while she sewed, the double note for the drawing-room, and she set the mending aside at once and went up, smoothing her apron as she climbed the back stairs, for a bell answered slowly was a small failure Mrs. Pargeter would hear of before the day was out, one way or another, in a house where news of that kind traveled the back passages faster than any of them quite understood. It was only her ladyship wanting the fire built up a little, the afternoon having turned colder than the morning had promised, and Nora knelt at the hearth and coaxed the flame higher with a few careful additions of coal, aware the whole time, in the particular sideways way one is aware of such things, of her ladyship at the writing desk by the window, pen moving steadily across paper, taking no more notice of the girl at the grate than she might of the clock ticking on the mantel, which was neither unkind nor kind, only the ordinary shape of the room, each of them about her own business within it. Back down she went, and the sewing waited a little longer while she helped carry the tea things through to the small drawing-room ahead of 4 o'clock. The good china taken from the cabinet and set out on the low table, the silver kettle filled and set to warm over its spirit lamp, the whole small ceremony of afternoon tea assembled with the same care that had gone into the fires at dawn, for a tea-tray set carelessly reflected on the house every bit as much as a grate left unblacked in Mrs. Pargeter's accounting of things, and Nora had learned that lesson early and thoroughly, and never once resented the learning of it. For there was a satisfaction in a tray laid exactly right, the cups turned just so, the sugar tongs resting at the correct angle, that she would have found hard to explain to anyone who had not felt it for themselves. The rest of the afternoon passed in this scattered, answerable way, a little sewing, a bell here and there, a errand down to the still room for a jar of the bramble jelly Mrs. Handley, the cook, had put by in September and wanted brought up for the tea table. The still room itself, a small cool space off the kitchen passage that always smelled of dried lavender and the ghost of 100 summers preserving, jars ranked on their shelves in labeled rows, each one a little store of a season already past. She liked being sent there, liked the quiet of it after the business of the kitchen proper, and took a moment longer than strictly needed to find the right jar, reading the labels in Mrs. Handley's careful round hand, bramble and quince, and a plum chutney marked "Not Yet," before carrying the jelly back up through the green baize door and into the warmth of the drawing-room fire she herself had built up not 2 hours before. By 5, the light was going fast, the way it did this time of year, the sky outside the sewing-room window turning from gray to a deeper gray, and then, almost without her noticing the change happen, to a blue-black that meant the lamps must be lit. This was work she had come to enjoy more than she once expected to, back when the trimming of wicks and the filling of reservoirs had seemed only one more chore among many. The house ran on oil lamps and candles through most of its rooms still, the family having put in the electric light only in the hall and the billiard room 2 years before, a set of globes that hummed faintly and cast a flat white glow Nora found handsome enough, but somehow less companionable than the warm moving light of a lamp. And it was the lamps that wanted her now, room by room, wicks trimmed straight, and even so they would not smoke. The glass chimneys wiped of yesterday's soot with a soft cloth kept especially for it, fresh oil poured in where a reservoir ran low, the whole small operation done with a care that came from knowing exactly what an ill-trimmed wick could do to a white ceiling by morning. She carried the lit lamps through on a tray, one at a time, where the stairs required both hands free, setting each on its accustomed table, and the rooms changed character as she went, the flat afternoon gray giving way to pools of gold light and long soft shadows. The fire she had built up earlier now settled into a steady glow that took the chill properly out of each room at last. There was a particular pleasure in this hour that she had never managed to name to her own satisfaction, something about the house drawing in on itself as the dark came down outside, the curtains drawn one after another with a soft rattle of rings along their poles, the whole build of the evening assembling itself under her hands the way the morning had come apart under them 12 hours before. The bedrooms wanted turning down before the family dressed for dinner, and this was work she did quickly and quietly, in and out of each room with barely a sound, the counterpane folded back to a precise triangle at the corner, the sheet turned down over it, a fresh can of hot water left by the washstand for whoever would be dressing there within the hour, the curtains drawn, a small fire made up if the room's occupant favored one at night, which most did this time of year. In her ladyship's room she turned back the bed and laid out the nightdress from its drawer, folded just so across the pillow, a small ritual repeated every evening of her 4 years in the house, and one she had never once found tedious, for there was something satisfying in a task performed the same way each time until the performing of it required no thought at all, only the pleasant motion of hands that knew exactly what they were about. Down in the kitchen, the dinner was building toward its own small climax, a great deal more elaborate than anything the servants' hall would see that night, and though none of that work was hers, she felt its heat and its hurry pass through the house all the same as she went about her own rounds, catching the smell of it on the stairs, roasting fowl and something with cloves in it, and the sharp green smell of watercress being washed at the scullery sink. William would be waiting on the family shortly, in his good coat, and Miss Ellen would already be upstairs dressing her ladyship's hair. And somewhere in it all, Mr. Sowerby moved with his usual unhurried authority, seeing that the whole complicated machine of an evening's dinner turned over without a hitch, which was, Nora understood without ever having been told so plainly, very nearly the whole of what a good butler was for. Her own supper came earlier and plainer, taken in the servants' hall, with those whose evening work was done, or nearly so, a dish of cold meat and pickle and bread, and a pot of tea, strong enough to see her through what remained of the evening's small tasks. The talk was quieter now than at dinner, the day's larger business behind most of them, and someone, the hall boy most likely, who had a fondness for such things, brought up the harvest supper that had been held back in September, the long tables set out in the barn and strung with lanterns, the fiddler brought over from the next village, and how cook had outdone herself with the pies that night, and how Mrs. Pargeter, of all people, had been persuaded onto the floor for one dance before retiring with great dignity to watch the rest of the evening from a chair by the door. It was a fondly worn story by now, told again because it bore telling again, and Nora had heard it perhaps a dozen times across her years in the house, and found she liked it no less for the repetition, the way one likes an old song for being known rather than despite it. There was a letter half written upstairs in the small tin box under her bed, begun 3 evenings before to her mother in the village 2 counties off, and she thought of it now over her tea, turning over in her mind what she still meant to put in it, that the roses along the south wall had been cut back for the winter, that Ivy's half-day was coming, and her own the week after, that she had put by 4 shillings more this quarter toward the little sum she was building against nothing in particular, only the quiet habit of putting by that her mother had taught her long before she ever came into service, and that would be paid out properly at the quarter's end, along with the rest of her wages, £16 the year, found in board and uniform besides, which was thought a fair wage for a house of this size, and had never once struck Nora as anything but exactly that. The last task of her working day, before the evening properly loosened its hold on her, was the kitchen passage and the back stairs, swept once more the day's last dust, and the scullery checked to see the pots were set to soak, and the range banked low for the night, with cook's own particular skill at judging exactly how much coal would keep it breathing till morning without burning itself out before the first riser came down to it. She did this last round with a lamp of her own, the house gone quiet around her in the particular way it went quiet each evening, the family's part of it lit and murmuring faintly with the sounds of dinner still in progress, the servant's part settling by degrees into the low hum of an evening's end, and felt, as she always did at this hour, the whole long day gathered up behind her, complete, nothing left undone that ought to have been done, which was as close to a private satisfaction as the day ever gave her, and was, she had long since decided, quite enough. The hour after supper belonged to no one upstairs at all, and Nora had learned early in her service to treasure it precisely because it asked nothing of her beyond her own choosing. She sat with Ivy and two of the other maids in the servants' hall, the table cleared now but for a branch of candles and the mending basket, and took up a stocking of her own with a hole worn through at the heel, darning it by the candle's steady light with the small wooden mushroom Ivy had lent her years before, and which had somehow never been returned, though neither of them ever spoke of it as anything but Nora's own. The wool was gray, close enough to the stocking's color that the mend would hardly show, and she worked the needle back and forth across the gap in the neat crosshatch her mother had taught her before she was 10 years old, the rhythm of it as familiar and undemanding as breathing, and let the talk of the room wash over her without needing to join it every moment. From somewhere beyond the green baize door, faint and softened by two closed doors and a length of passage, came the sound of the piano being played in the drawing-room, one of the young ladies down for the shooting party trying over something slow and unfamiliar, the notes reaching the servants' hall thin and disconnected, more a suggestion of music than music itself, and Nora found she liked it that way, liked catching only the ghost of a tune rather than the whole of it, the way one might catch the scent of a garden through a wall without ever seeing the flowers. William came through once, collecting the last of the coffee things, still in his good coat, and reported that the gentleman had gone through to the billiard-room, and her ladyship had asked for the fire built up once more before bed, which was not Nora's task tonight, that duty falling to whichever housemaid was nearest the bell when it rang, and tonight it fell to one of the others, and Nora sat on with her darning glad of the quiet turn the evening had taken for her. The talk in the hall drifted, as it often did this late, toward small and comfortable things. Sarah's opinion that the new curate was a poor hand at his sermons, though a decent enough young man otherwise, a discussion of whether the frost that had silvered the lawn that morning would hold hard enough to be worth telling the gardener to cover the last of the dahlias, a bit of teasing, directed at the hall boy, over the girl in the village that he bore with more good humor than embarrassment. Mrs. Pargeter looked in once, not to hurry them along, only to see that the lamps were trimmed for the night and the fire in the hall grate banked properly, and stayed a few minutes longer than her errand strictly required, asking Ivy after her mother and telling Nora in passing and without any great ceremony that the library grate had drawn beautifully all week, and she was glad of it, a small remark that Nora tucked away and would carry with her unremarked upon through the rest of the evening, the quiet private pleasure of work noticed and found good. By 9:30 the stocking was mended and the basket put away, and the little group in the servants' hall began to break up by ones and twos, Sarah first, yawning behind her hand, then the hall boy sent off by Mr. Sowerby with instructions about the boots to be done before he went, and at last Nora and Ivy took up a single candle between them, for the household economized on wax as on everything else worth economizing on, and went together along the flagged passage and up the back stairs, the same stairs worn hollow in their centers that she had come down 12 hours before in the dark, now climbed again in a different dark, the candle throwing its small warm circle of light just far enough ahead of them to show the next few steps and no more. The attic passage was cold again, colder than any part of the house below, the day's warmth never quite finding its way up under the slates, and Nora's breath showed pale once more as it had that morning, though her body no longer minded the cold the way it had at 5:30, worn as she was into a tiredness that made the chill feel almost welcome. A clean, plain thing after a day full of textures and smells and the small, unceasing business of hands, all was occupied. She undressed quickly in the dark, folding her afternoon dress over the chair by feel, the apron and cap set aside for the wash, and pulled her nightgown down over her head, the linen cool at first and then, almost at once, warmed by her own skin into something close and comfortable. Ivy was already murmuring some last remark about the morning to come, the fires to be laid, the frost likely to make the water in the ewer skin over again by dawn, and Nora answered her, half a word, already half gone from the day into whatever lay beyond it, and climbed into her own bed, the ropes beneath the thin mattress giving their familiar small complaint, and drew the counterpane up to her chin. The window showed a narrow strip of sky above the opposite roof line, no moon that she could see, only a scatter of stars hard and small and very far off, and somewhere below, muffled by 2 floors of house between, she thought she could still catch the faintest thread of the piano, though it might only have been the wind finding some gap in the old slates. She could not have said which with any certainty, and did not much care to try. Her body ached in its ordinary places, the knees from the stair rods, the shoulders from the water cans, the small tightness across her back from bending so many times over so many hearths, and she let the ache settle rather than fighting it, the way she had learned to do across 4 years of days built exactly like this one, each ache a kind of proof that the day had been full and had been hers. Tomorrow would begin the same way it always began, the bell of the stable clock finding her before any other bell could, the cold coming up through the floorboards, the dark to be dressed in, and the stairs to be gone down, and the grates to be found waiting, patient and familiar, for her hands. She did not think of tomorrow now with anything like dread, only the loose, formless awareness of it waiting its turn somewhere beyond sleep, no more troubling than the next stair in a staircase she had climbed 1,000 times before and would climb 1,000 times again. Ivy's breathing had already gone slow, and even in the other bed, and the candle between them had long since been pinched out, so that the room held nothing now but the cold, clean dark and the small sounds of an old house settling around her, a creak somewhere in the roof timbers, the faint tick of the frost beginning to work at the window glass, the whole vast, quiet machinery of the house below her, drawing itself down toward stillness, floor by floor, the way it did every night at this hour, fires banked, lamps trimmed, doors seen to, the day's long labor folded away at last into rest. Nora turned once onto her side, drew her knees up beneath the counterpane, felt the last of the day's warmth gather close around her, and let go, without any struggle at all, into sleep.